Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 14th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. The first agenda item for members of the committee is to decide whether or not to take agenda items 3, 4 and 5 this morning in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. And our principal agenda item this morning is further consideration by the committee of the joint report prepared by the Auditor General for Scotland and the Accounts Commission on additional support for learning. So I'm very pleased to welcome this morning representatives from both the Scottish Government and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. You're very welcome. Can I welcome Neil Rennick, who's the Director General of Education and Justice at the Scottish Government, Stella Smith, who is the Unit Head for Additional Support for Learning in the Scottish Government, and Claire Henderson, who's the Team Leader for Additional Support for Learning in the Scottish Government. Welcome. And alongside them are Laura Caven from COSLA, who's the Chief Officer for Children and Young People in COSLA, but also the co-chair of the Additional Support for Learning Project Board, which we may have some questions about over the course of this morning. Also with us is Suzanne MacLeod, who's a policy manager in the employers team at COSLA, and Joanna Anderson, who's a policy manager for local government and finance team in COSLA. We have got a number of questions that we'd like to put to both of your teams that are here this morning. But before we get to our questions, Director General, can I invite you to make a short opening statement?
Thank you, Convener. I welcome this opportunity to provide evidence on behalf of the Scottish Government in relation to Audit Scotland's briefing on additional support for learning. I'm pleased to provide this evidence alongside colleagues from COSLA. We have an inclusive education system in Scotland, which focuses on getting it right for every child and overcoming barriers to learning. The 2004 Act is intended to meet the diverse needs of all pupils. The legislation reflects the reality that additional support needs can arise in short and long term and form a variety of circumstances. The definition of additional support needs is purposefully wide. As Audit Scotland note in their briefing, there has been a significant increase in the number of pupils identified with additional support needs over the past 2 decades. The reasons for this growth are complex and varied. Whilst progress has been made to implement the 2004 Act, we fully acknowledge that challenges and barriers remain, and we are now responding to a very different context. In partnership with COSLA, we've been working to deliver the recommendations in response to the Morgan Review through the ASL Action Plan. The actions are focused at both national and local levels to address the challenges and to support the necessary shift in culture, leadership and delivery. In our most recent Action Plan Progress Report, published in November, we reported that 40 of the 76 actions had been successfully completed, and since then, a further 13 have been completed. The jointly chaired project board is focusing on the delivery of the remaining actions before the end of this parliamentary term, with a particular focus on communications, the national measurement framework and consulting on a refreshed code of practice for the legislation. The Audit Scotland briefing makes 2 recommendations on improving the quality of data on ASL and for the national and local government to review how ASL provision is planned, funded and staffed. We accept both of those recommendations and are working to take them forward alongside the remaining commitments in the action plan. I want to close by acknowledging the important role that parents, carers and children and young people themselves play in engaging with professionals to inform the many thousands of individual decisions that are taken to translate the principles of the legislation and guidance into reality. I look forward to discussing these important and complex issues with the committee this morning. Thank you.
Director General, thank you very much indeed. You said that you told us about the recommendations which have been taken forward and your acknowledgement of the findings of the report. But could I just check for the record, does the Scottish Government accept the findings, conclusions and key messages from this briefing by the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission?
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
And Laura Caven, can I ask you the same question? Does COSLA accept the findings, recommendations and key messages from this briefing paper?
Yes, we do. Yes,
yes you do. Thank you very much. So, just then, to be clear about it, key message number one is about the context in which you are operating and delivering these services, isn't it? And so that talks about an 8-fold increase over the last 20 years. So quite a huge rise in the scale of additional support for learning that's been demanded. And within that, a gender breakdown, which shows, I think, that boys are more likely to be in need of additional support than girls are in our school system, and also a contrast between the least and the most deprived areas, where there appears to be a requirement for additional support needs twice the rate in the most deprived areas compared to the least deprived areas. So can I just, again, confirm with you that you accept those findings as being an accurate assessment of where we are? Again, Director General, may I start with you? Yes,
I'm happy to cover in more detail the kind of reasons for that and what's underlying it. But
sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and we will get to those. Can I? And we'll get to these other areas too. But again, just because they are part of the key messages at the start of the report, I just want to get on record whether you accept these key messages, because there are some criticisms in here as well from the Auditor General and the Accounts Commission, which we will get into more detail on. But there is in message 2, the point is made that there are inconsistencies and gaps in data recording. You accept that as a deficiency in the way things are working at the moment?
Yes, and again, happy to cover in more detail some of the complexities around the data associated with additional support needs. But yes, we accept that there are those gaps and inconsistencies.
Okay. And you accept as well the conclusion that it's difficult to assess whether the Scottish Government, councils and their partners are planning for and providing the appropriate support to meet pupils' needs in line with their rights?
Yes, and again, we can get in this in more detail, but I think that's true not just here in Scotland, but across the UK and internationally as well. There are significant challenges, both in the growth in additional support needs and then in assessing the right outcomes in response to that.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're describing an international phenomenon, but this report obviously is about the Scottish Government. Yes. And its responsibilities. And key message number 4 is the Scottish Government has not planned effectively for the potential impact of this approach to ASL. I mean, how do you respond to that, Director General?
Yeah, in the Morgan report, it concluded that the circumstances since the 2004 Act was passed and implemented have changed significantly, and that it wasn't predictable the scale of change, both in terms of the recording of need and the levels of need as well, and the wider context in which we're operating. And similarly, the Education and Young People Committee's report on additional support for learning said that many people did not predict the scale of change that we would experience over that time. So I accept that the level of change has been different from what was anticipated at the time that the Act was introduced.
But you therefore accept the criticism that's been levelled at you, that you've not effectively planned for that change.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, I accept that that it's very hard to plan for the scale of change that we have seen over the past decade, and over particularly since 2010, since the criteria were updated. So yes, I accept that has been incredibly challenging in terms of planning for what that is. That doesn't mean that actions haven't been taken at a national level, haven't been taken by local government, haven't been taken by individual schools. There has been a huge amount of activity and lots of positive progress. And again, the Children's Commissioner, the Education Committee and the Morgan Review all identify good examples of good practice in responding to the needs of young people. So I don't want to say that there hasn't been progress made, but there is a significant scale of challenge that we are still responding to.
Yeah, well, and we'll get into more detail on this, and I'm going to bring Colin Beattie in short order. But just to be clear, one of the fundamental criticisms which is levelled at the Scottish Government and COSLA, I guess, in this report, are the gaps in data. And in order to plan, you need evidence, and you need to be able to follow that evidence and make sure the resources are going in the right way. I mean, presumably, data collection, which we will get into in some detail, but presumably data collection is entirely within your gift, and it is something that you could produce in a format, in a way that's consistent across local authorities, that allows you to form a national picture and understand where £8 billion worth of public expending in education services ought to go.
Yeah, and as you say, there are variations, and sometimes there are reasons for those variations. So there are reasons why certain local authorities, for example, have higher proportions of pupils with English as an additional language compared to other local authorities. So some of that variation is understandable. Some of it is less clear why that's there. The way in which data is collected in terms of additional support for learning, and again, colleagues from COSLA and from our own team can talk on that in more detail with more expertise, but that is collected through systems where individual teachers and schools are recording information on the CMIS system for thousands and thousands of individual pupils and a whole variety of different interventions for them. So it is a complex set of information that is being collected. So it's understandable why there are those variations, but the scale of them does cause concern and is an issue that we've been working to try and respond to, both in terms of recording need, the interventions, and crucially as well the outcomes that come from those interventions.
Yeah, and the CMIS system is the Scottish Education Management Information System, isn't it?
Yes.
Which is the data collection. Right, OK, I'm going to now invite Colin Beattie to put some questions to you. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to start actually with the question of tribunals. There's been an increase in the use of the additional support needs tribunal, something like 2/3 over recent years. Now, that's an awful lot. Now, as I understand it, there is no requirement for mediation to take place, and that the parents or whoever can go straight to the tribunal. Is that an efficient way to do it? Should there be a requirement to first seek mediation before going to the tribunal?
Again, I'm very happy if the committee is to bring others in. In terms of, there has been that growth in the number of cases before the tribunal. It still accounts, thankfully, for a relatively small proportion of the total number of young people with additional support needs. But certainly, our view and the view of the system would be, as much as possible, it is much better to resolve these issues at a much earlier stage and not have them have to go to the tribunal if that is possible. There is a requirement on local authorities to have mediation and other arrangements in place, and clearly a strong incentive for individual local authorities and schools to have those arrangements in place. So we would much rather not have cases reach the tribunal if that is possible, but that involves a whole range of work to provide that confidence to parents. And again, one of the key themes within the action plan is about improving communication and engagement with between schools and parents and carers as well. But I don't know if COSLA colleagues want to say more about the tribunals.
Certainly. It's an area that comes up consistently at our Children and Young People Board, which is usually the convener of each education committee in local authorities. And they recognise and are concerned about the increase. It's always better. I mean, the first stage would be that parents engage with, or children themselves engage with the school, and then perhaps the education authority, and then there is the option of mediation, which we would encourage. In terms of the increase, given that we've seen a significant increase in the number of children and young people, or recorded children and young people with additional support needs, the proportion or the number of tribunals has increased, but given the number of children and young people with additional support needs has increased significantly, then it's almost understandable. One of the key concerns, I suppose, of local government is the cost associated with those and the time associated with those, because if they're preparing for tribunals, then they're not able to be doing other things. We would always encourage parents, children, young people to engage with the school in the first instance.
Now, Neil Rennick said that there's a requirement for local authorities to provide or make available mediation, but there is no requirement for that as part of the process. So if the parents or whoever want to go straight to the tribunal, they can do that. Is that the most efficient way to do it? Surely mediation should be a requirement before going to the tribunal.
I think ideally yes, but you have to be willing to go to go into that process. And we would always encourage, and we are working on communications around that. One of the key actions that we're focused on just now is around communications with children, young people, families, school staff, others, to promote options like that. But it is voluntary. You can't forcing people to mediate isn't going to be the most effective way to reach a conclusion. But it is there, and I mean, as much as possible, we'd be promoting that. I don't know that you could make it mandatory that you go through that process, because you would have to go into a mediation process willingly.
Well, it's a bit like a complaint process, isn't it? You have to go through the steps.
Well, yes,
and mediation could logically be one of these steps. Now, it's not going to work with everybody, but surely it would take some of the strain off the tribunals, because, there may not be a huge number of people, but it takes up a huge amount of time and cost. Mediation frequently works.
Certainly the Inquire service, which is the advice service on additional support for learning, they make clear in their advice that the vast majority of disagreements or disputes can be resolved without having to go to a formal tribunal process, and that's the advice that they give to parents.
But there's no intention at all to make it a mandatory step in the process.
I'm not aware of that being, I don't know, Stella.
Well, just to be clear, that we would need to change the legislation to make it mandatory.
It's not a train smash. It can be done if that's the right thing to do.
I mean, certainly the principle is right that the more that we can do to better share information and share understanding of what services are available and what support young people need, then that's a much better way of resolving issues than have them reach tribunal if that's possible.
I get the impression that there's not a great enthusiasm to make mediation a mandatory step in this.
Can I come back in? I'm very happy to pick that up with the project board, because we have representation from parents' organisations on that project board. So it's perhaps something that we could discuss there with them, and I'm happy to follow up in writing once we've had that discussion with them. Because you're right. I mean, it would greatly lessen the burden isn't the right word, but you know what I mean in terms of tribunals. But I come back to the fact that it would be incredibly difficult to enforce people to go into a mediation process.
Just moving on to definition of ASL. The committee's heard that the definition of ASL is very broad. And I think you yourself, Neil Rennick, said at the very beginning that it was deliberately wide. I'd be interested to know why it being deliberately wide is a good thing.
I mean, the roots of inclusive education and education for all are long established internationally, at least back to the Salamanca Declaration by UNESCO in 1994, and even before that. So it's a long-running aspiration to make education as inclusive as possible and to focus on supporting all young people to learn, rather than focusing on a deficit model or a health-based model, focusing on a model that reflects what needs to be done to support all young people to be educated, that necessarily requires a wide approach in terms of responding to what those needs are. That was reflected by the Parliament in the 2004 Act and has been added to over time in terms of further legislation, and also the criteria that we use for measuring additional support needs as well. And as far as I'm aware, and again colleagues will come in, the international evidence from the OECD, UNESCO, the UN, etc., is all still supportive of that inclusive model of education.
I'm just looking at a chart here from one of my local councils. I'm going to refer to it when I'm talking about definitions rather than the actual figures, interesting though they are. I'm looking at a whole spectrum of categories here that the local council uses as its data collection. Given the breadth of all these, is it actually possible to train a teacher to be able to cover all these points? I mean, you've got dyslexia, English as an additional language, family issues, hearing impairment, interrupted learning, learning disabilities, mental health problems. It's a lot for a school to deal with.
I'll bring colleagues in if that's okay, but important thing to say is responding to additional support needs is not an add-on to what teachers do. It has always been part of what teachers do, and over time the training that teachers receive in their initial teacher training, the codes of practice that they follow, have focused on that inclusive approach and responding to the needs of all individual children and young people, and that has always been the case in classes. You're right that the recording and recognition of additional support needs has expanded significantly over the last decade and more, and I don't deny that is placing challenges on not just our teachers but our school leaders, our local authorities, and we in government as well, that we are responding to. But I would much rather be in the position where we are recognising and acknowledging those needs than not. But Stella or Claire, I don't know if you wanted to say any more around teacher training and support.
Sorry, I think this is on. I suppose the point that's really good to remember is the purpose of the Act and the purpose of what we're trying to achieve through the inclusive practice is about removing barriers to learning. So those can appear for a range of different reasons, and some of the lists that you've read out today are some of the challenges we're seeing. The complexity has changed, so there's new things that we're aware of, such as carers, children who are care supported. These are all things that we've learned and developed, and schools are recognising in a teaching capacity. In terms of teachers specifically themselves, they have particular standards with which the GTC set in terms of what content on inclusive practice they should learn through initial teacher education, through continued professional learning, part of their probation, and how they might consider that and adapt throughout their career. So there's a whole wealth and range of modules that they can dip in and out of in terms of how they learn about specific needs if there's something that they come across which they've not got particular depth of knowledge about, and that's something that they would then actually follow up on, and local authorities and schools would encourage that.
If I could just add, we also have 29 million allocated in the most recent Scottish Government budget to support the recruitment, retention and training of the workforce.
Okay. Can I ask for a clarification on one thing? We've got all these categories. Are these categories laid down by the Scottish Government? Are they guidelines or are they set in legislation?
As I understand it, and I'll bring colleagues in, they are categories that are recorded on the CMIS system, so that they're not restrictive in terms of there are other categories, so they're intended to try and cover the needs of all children and young people, so there isn't a limitation in terms of that. Those are the ones that have been identified. Additional ones have been added on over time. I'll bring Stella in, but I just wanted to going back to your earlier question, I just want to be absolutely clear that I am not in any way understating the challenges that our teachers face in responding to those needs at all. And certainly when I go around to schools and speak to teachers and to school leaders, they say there has been a genuine change in terms of the level and complexity of need that they are facing, and that they're having to be imaginative in terms of how they respond to that. But Stella.
You don't need to press your microphone on.
Okay, sorry. Yes, it may be that local authority colleagues want to come in on CMIS. It's primarily the school and local authority data management system and used by all of them for operational purposes. In terms of the categories, we are planning over the next year to scope a data project, and that's one of the issues that can be considered in that context.
Okay, Laura?
Yeah. So coming back to your initial question, the categories are important, but what the more important aspect is like identifying the need and the barrier to learning. So many of the categories will have the same need. The need to overcome the barrier to learning, or the support need, will be the same for some of these children that are in different categories. So it's about how we respond to the need rather than the categories, although these are helpful and important. In terms of the workforce, the teaching workforce, the school workforce, and how they are able to support such a range of needs in schools, that's where the importance of partnership working with our third sector colleagues, our NHS colleagues, our wider public sector colleagues comes in, because we need all of the professionals that support children and young people to be involved in advising teachers, supporting the wider school workforce. So there's really good innovative work going on in local authorities where health and schools are working together on training models and things like that, so that the school can be an inclusive and supportive environment.
There's one particular category that my local authorities would like to change, frankly, and that's autism. Because it is such a wide spectrum, it would appear that there are huge differences from one end of the spectrum to the other, and of the intensity of support that's required and so on. Wouldn't it make sense, since this is one of the most intensive areas, to have a better breakdown, better understanding of what's within that category?
So one important thing to note is that you do not need a diagnosis of anything to receive support. So the support should be available in schools regardless of whether you have a diagnosis. So I think that the other thing to note is that teachers, they cannot diagnose. They provide the support as the child presents themselves in the classroom, but they cannot provide a diagnosis. That isn't for them to do, and therefore any kind of further categorisation within any of these health-related categories, although arguably not a health-related category, would not be for teachers to do. That would be quite difficult. The category of other, often that is where we know that there's a need, but we don't really know what the reason for the need is. But that's less important than supporting the need and making sure that the child has the support for their learning. So I suppose it's a really tricky one, but the important thing to emphasise is that there is no need for a diagnosis or anything like that for the support to be provided. It should be identified within the classroom, within the school, within the wider child's plan.
But surely if you drill down to understanding where the more complex cases are, that allows you to plan ahead and allows you to allocate the resources that are needed. If you just have one big amorphous figure, it's kind of difficult to know what resources that's needing.
Certainly more than happy for that to get picked up in the data work in terms of that differentiation, if that's something local authorities are raising. But I also recognise, even when you have that differentiation and classification, that may not mean that two young people will require the same inputs. Individual young people might require different inputs, even though they have a similar need, depending on their individual circumstances.
But having such broad categories, doesn't that lead to a certain amount of uniformity in the approach, one size fits all?
That's not the intention and not the way in which I have seen schools operating. What I've seen schools doing is responding to the needs of, or trying to respond to the needs of individual children.
Schools wouldn't be responding to whatever the diagnosis is or whatever the category is. They'll be responding to the need that presents itself. They won't be. So there is we have an individualised approach within schools, within classrooms. GIRFIC is the national approach to supporting children holistically, and therefore, regardless of any of the categories, there would be that individualised support.
I still come back to the basic question. If you don't know where the greatest need is, how do you know where to put the greatest resources? And if it's just in a big pot, how do you do that? You're relying on the schools locally to somehow handle that. The
local authority will know who is coming into the school because they'll know from health visitors, from nurseries, from ELC centres. So they'll be able to plan for the children that are coming into schools. And also, it isn't just about the schools, it's about, as I said, the wider partners that play a role in this as well. I recognise the complexity that you're identifying there. But it isn't just for schools, it isn't just for teachers, it isn't just for local authorities. It has to be a whole system approach to supporting that child and that family.
If you've got all the information at local authority level, I mean, the Scottish Government has also got a role here because it's allocating the funding at the end of the day. And it needs to know the funding's going to the right place. How can the Scottish Government be absolutely sure the funding's going to the right place and in the right quantity if we don't have disaggregated figures?
It's a long time since I worked in local government finance, but the distribution arrangements are agreed jointly between the Scottish Government and local government. So those distribution arrangements are agreed. They tend not to link with specific subjective assessments in terms of additional support needs. So that's not one of the factors that is reflected within the distribution formula, but a range of other factors are, including deprivation, including pupil numbers, etc.
There's also things can affect the funding here. I mean, is it a long-term need? Is it a short-term need? You know, all these need different resources.
Yeah.
Joanna may want to comment on the arrangements around local government funding distribution.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. So I suppose the local government settlement is an extremely complicated thing. I suppose there are lots of different funding lines, each with their own distribution methodologies, and then there's processes behind agreeing those distribution methodologies. As the Director General referenced, we do have joint governance groups. We've got the Settlement and Distribution Group, joint local government and Scottish Government. So any funding lines that come through, any new funding lines or any changes, proposed changes to existing funding lines will go through this process. There'll be an assessment of what is the best fit for the policy intent of specific funding. Any considerations of distribution methodologies will be guided by kind of underlying principles, the key one being that will be driven by underlying data and needs. It is quite a live discussion around ASN distribution and the link to, say, deprivation. That was discussed just recently at the Settlement and Distribution Group. There was some consideration of whether there needs to be an element of deprivation added to the distribution of the 28 million ASN funding. The conclusion of that was that there needs to be more consideration of the data. So hopefully that's reassuring that there is those kind of ongoing discussions. There will be the kind of more thought giving to that and considering the kind of the data that is available, but it's very much on the radar of the group.
Okay, I'll move on. ASL provision, obviously, in mainstream, has an impact on other pupils who are getting education. Has there been any evaluation of any impact on the learning outcomes for pupils who don't receive ASL?
Again, as I say, there's lots of international experience and evidence. There's huge variation in terms of how services are delivered across the country, and a range of research into the impacts of that. The general view is that it is beneficial for young people to be in inclusive education environments, and that's beneficial for all young people, not just those with additional support needs. And the evidence in terms of the performance of our pupils and the number going on to positive destinations would suggest that their education outcomes continue to be positive.
I mean, we hear about circumstances where some of the pupils receiving ASL can be disruptive at times in the classroom. And is there any sort of evaluation as to what sort of impact that has overall in terms of the educational outcomes of those that are not receiving ASL?
Yeah, we recognise that both disruption by pupils who have additional support needs and those who don't have additional support needs has a significant impact on the operation of schools and other pupils. We've obviously been taking forward joint work with COSLA in terms of behaviour, relationship and also consequences in schools to try and reflect that and make sure that we're considering the needs of all children. I think one of the issues that we discuss is the extent to which if you don't properly respond to additional support needs, that may be a factor in terms of behaviour and other issues. So it's important that we make sure that we're identifying those needs early and responding to them as much as possible to avoid those issues arising. But I don't know if any colleagues want to add to that.
I'm happy to come in. So the Additional Support Needs Project Board, Additional Learning Project Board, works quite closely with, now I'm going to get this right, Sagrabus, the Scottish Advisory Group on Relationships and Behaviour in Schools. So there's quite a lot of crossover in membership, and it is also a joint Scottish Government COSLA group. So we do make sure that the work that Sagrabus are doing links with the work, or crosses over with the work of the Additional Support for Learning Project Board, because it's important that they're working in tandem.
I suppose it's worth recognising that it's not just a small minority of ASL pupils that can be disruptive. Those that don't receive ASL can sometimes be a bit disruptive too.
Convener, if it's okay, I was looking for an opportunity to say this. I visited an after-school service in Perth recently, which uses a model of having young people as volunteers, and that includes young people with additional support needs, some of whom had been in that service previously as service recipients and were now acting as volunteers, and then other young people without additional support needs. And it was a fantastic example of young people contributing to their community, contributing to other young people with additional support needs. And I'm really keen that we promote those kind of models and those examples of our young people contributing alongside some of the genuine issues that we're facing as well.
I suppose the last question I would like to ask is about those receiving ASL. Is there any assurance that these people's needs are actually being met? The Scottish Government obviously has a policy of inclusivity, which is quite right. But how do we know, how do we evaluate that the ASL pupils' needs are being met and that the outcomes are the best possible?
Certainly looking at the Morgan review and the Education Committee's review, both of them concluded that there are really positive examples of additional support needs being met and innovation in that responding to young people's needs. Some of the inspection results that we can talk about as well give some good practice examples of that. And again, you as MSPs, I'm sure, visit schools in your local areas and see examples of that as well. So there are lots and lots of positive examples of young people's needs being met. But we also know that parents and carers raise concerns and teachers raise concerns about their capacity to meet those needs. So I think it is a complex picture of some really positive examples and positive progress, but some continuing challenge in responding to the needs is the honest answer. The results in terms of going to positive destinations are still relatively high for pupils with additional support needs, but they are behind pupils who don't have additional support needs, although that gap has narrowed. So there is certainly more that we can do to ensure that all children and young people get the support they need. But I don't know if Laura and others want to come in.
Claire might want to say a bit more, but there's been work ongoing for quite a while, but the work is intensifying around the National Measurement Framework, which is looking to ensure that we're capturing the outcomes of children and young people who receive additional support within the school setting. And that work has been informed by professionals, has been in terms of Director of Education, but also Education Scotland and others around the ASL Project Board. And I know that Scottish Government were that is one of the three areas that we're focusing on as a project board this year. So I don't know if Claire wants to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the National Measurement Framework has been a priority for some time. It's been particularly challenging to develop and implement, and as you would expect, requires a kind of cross-policy, cross-sector collaboration to actually get to a place where we're all content that what we're trying to achieve is practical, is helpful from a local authority perspective, and importantly is actually going to support self-improvement within schools, but also demonstrate the achievement and success for all children and young people. So this year we're having a particular focus where we're working with our analysts specifically to build a platform for the National Measurement Framework, which will sit under the NIF, which is the National Improvement Framework. So as a first iteration, that will bring together all of the ASL data into one place, and there will be particular breakdowns. Sorry, I'm not an analyst, but there will be particular breakdowns that will inform what we know about additional support for learning. And then there are two further iterations that we'll be building upon that to get to the more individualised success and achievements, to understand what does that look like and are we having the impact that we want to see. So that's very much a focus of the ASL Project Board, particularly for the next year, but actually for the coming years as well. We obviously need to be mindful that all the data recommendations that came from Audit Scotland will be happening at the same time, and both need to happen in parallel so that they inform each other. But it's a really positive step that we've got to this place, and I know that the Inspectorate have been involved, Education Scotland and local authorities, so it's really good we're all signed up to that. And just to add to a point that the Director General mentioned around inspections, that's obviously really critical for us in terms of trying to understand whether we're successful, whether the education system is responding to the needs that we have. And this year they've committed to having a particular focus on ASL, but more broadly as well, I think, around attendance, behaviour, curriculum development, just to really support a more informed understanding of the performance of our schools, and to really get into that detail of actually are we driving and meeting the outcomes of all children and young people, which is also really positive too.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think you made a point a few minutes ago which Stuart McMillan picked up on and I think wanted to ask you a question about. So, Stuart, I'll bring you in at this point.
Thank you, Convener. It's a question for Joanne Anderson. A few months ago when you spoke about the 29 million and also the further dialogue could take place with regards to the funding. But at the very beginning of the session, both the Scottish Government and COSLA did indicate, after the convener had asked the question about do you agree with the key recommendations, do you agree with the report, and both did agree. But certainly, because key recommendation 1, just to go over this point again, it was that with the proportion of Scotland's most deprived areas, almost double that in the least deprived areas. So I don't understand why there has to be further dialogue in terms of the distribution of monies when the report is very clear, and both COSLA and the Scottish Government have already agreed with the recommendations in the report. So I'd certainly seek some clarification on that, please.
Yeah, of course. So I suppose the discussion was brought to SDG because of that kind of, I suppose there is an understanding that there is a link between ASN deprivation. So that was why the proposal was brought to SDG to consider whether deprivation needs to be included in the distribution methodology, because we have to have these kind of the proposals need to go through our governance structures. So I suppose the discussion at the group was that, I suppose, theoretically, we know that there is that kind of link there. The data that was presented as part of that discussion didn't show a clear correlation. I think the issue was the data that was presented in the data that was available. A lot of that looked at spend, so the regression analysis, looking at where spend is compared to deprivation. Some of that wasn't quite clear, but I suppose a lot of that, there is a barrier to using that in terms of consideration distribution, because councils will be limited in the spend that they have. They will spend it kind of where they have it. So there is a commitment to bring that back to the group. I understand that is actually coming this month or next month, looking at what further data. So I suppose there is that kind of understanding that there is the link. It's just having the data to kind of evidence that. But we are working towards kind of showing that. It's just about evidencing.
It's okay for me to say as well that there are other sources of funding in addition to the general local government grants. So, for example, the Scottish Attainment Challenge. So, again, spoken to a number of schools who said that they've used their PEF funding that goes directly to schools for services that obviously reflect deprivation but specifically benefit children and young people with additional support needs. Similarly, a number of local authorities have used their whole family wellbeing funding for projects linked to additional support needs as well. So that there are other sources of funding that do reflect that.
I do acknowledge that point about the additional sources of funding. And I also acknowledge the point that you raised there, Ms Anderson, but certainly because at the very beginning of this session, both Scottish Government and COSLA agreed with the recommendations and the points on the back of the convener's questioning. So I, with that on the record, I certainly would expect now, with the definition point, I would expect areas where there is a higher level of deprivation, and also the children with ASL needs. I would expect that these local authorities would then actually start to get additional resource to help them deliver the services that are required for the children, and also certainly to help the families as well.
Can I come back in? Is that okay? I suppose that there is a complexity. Well, I mean, the whole area is complex, but the cost doesn't necessarily correlate with the needs, if you know what I mean. You can have one of the definitions is, I think, around bereavement or something like that. Very important short term, but you know, if that's high at the point of recording, then it could be a relatively low cost to provide that support. It's probably not the best of examples, but you would have to sort of dig deep into the reasons for support and the support being provided to know the cost of the support as well. And it gets even more complex when you're thinking about the role of health or the role of any other organisation as well. However, I take on board your points and happy to consider that.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks. Before we move on, can I go back as well to a fundamental point that was made by the Auditor General when he gave evidence before the committee on the 19th of March. What he said that day was that there has been an almost eightfold increase in the number of children and young people who need additional support for learning. However, that is not reflected in how councils are funded for their education service. Do you accept that criticism, Director General?
As I say, the way in which funding is allocated to local authorities is agreed jointly with COSLA. Although there has been that eightfold increase in the identification and reflection of additional support for learning, part of that is needs that were always there and always reflected. Part of it is new needs that have emerged or new needs that have been identified over that period. The important thing to say is that for the majority of young people with additional support needs, they will receive the main part of support from their classroom teacher, so from the teacher that is providing that education, and then there will be a range of other supports that to different degrees that young people will receive. So although they may have although they may have additional support needs, that doesn't necessarily translate into additional costs, but it will for some and won't for others. Some of those needs will be short-term rather than long-term. For example, we know in primary schools, English as an additional language is a significant factor, but we know that schools do a lot of work, particularly primary schools, to address that and ensure that as people move into secondary school, they're better prepared. So it's an issue, obviously, we committed to looking at, not just in terms of funding, but also the training that's available for staff, how services are delivered. So it's, in accepting that recommendation from the Auditor General, we're committing to looking more broadly at how additional support needs are reflected and supported. Okay.
But, yeah, I'm not quite sure from that whether you grasp what I took to be a fairly fundamental criticism of the funding arrangements, and in part perhaps reflects Mr Macmillan's point that the report is clear that there is a direct correlation between the levels of deprivation and the requirement for additional support for learning in those areas. Are you satisfied that the current funding arrangement meets the challenge that's created by deprivation, inequality, English not being the first language, for example, which you've mentioned a couple of times this morning? Do you think that the funding arrangements properly represent that?
I think my take would be that the current Scottish Government have put significant effort over the last few years and significant commitment trying to respond to that attainment gap that is deprivation linked. So that has been a key priority in what we do. In broad terms, Scotland spends more per pupil than any other part of the UK. We have lower pupil-teacher ratios than any other part of the UK. That is not the same as saying that there aren't children and young people that are not having their needs met and that we're not having to respond to that. But a lot of the input elements would be encouraging in terms of how we're responding to that. But I wouldn't want to say that doesn't mean that there isn't more for us to do, both in terms of how those needs are met and what resources are required to meet those needs.
Yeah, if you forgive me, Director General, there's a bit of an air of complacency about that, because what the Auditor General also said on the 19th of March was that there now, and this is just a few weeks ago he's saying this, there now needs to be a fundamental review of how the system is operating and whether it is meeting the needs of children and young people. So that sounds like a pretty fundamental challenge to the way that the additional support for learning is being funded, where the funds have been distributed, whether the monitoring and data collection is working properly. Do you accept that criticism?
I'm really glad you raised that, because I don't want the committee to get any impression that there's an air of complacency around this at official level or ministerial level, and I don't think from local government either. I think, as I reflected at the beginning, we have seen massive increases positively in terms of identifying young people's needs. Lots of positive examples of schools innovating and responding to that. But I don't think anyone reading the Morgan Review in 2020, the committee's review last year, would say there is not significantly further for us to do in terms of responding to those needs. That is partly reflected in the work of on the action plan, but clearly we recognise there is more to do beyond that, and these are complex issues that we need to keep working through. So I want to give you and the committee assurance that there is no complacency around that, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of young people with needs who we are trying to respond to.
OK, I'm going to move things on and invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'll just continue on this theme, if you don't mind. So here are some figures. Just under half, 46% of pupils from the most deprived areas receive additional support for learning, compared to just under a quarter, just over a quarter, 27% in the least deprived areas. Any idea why that should be? I mean, maybe it's obvious, but have you actually delved into the reasoning for it?
I'll bring colleagues in on that. I mean, it is complicated. It is not that there are more variations than just purely around deprivation within the numbers, and there are variations in terms of different types of need as well. So, for example, I visited South Ayrshire last week. They have relatively high levels of dyslexia recorded compared to other local authorities. Glasgow, I think, as I mentioned earlier, has very high levels in terms of English as an additional language, and there are other factors that are driving that additional to or linked with deprivation as well. So it's a more complex picture than just purely a binary connection between those two. But I don't know if colleagues either from local government or from the Scottish Government wanted to add to that.
If I could just come in, I suppose, on the complexity point. So just to give you an example, looking at our current data, Glasgow Inverclyde has high levels of deprivation and high levels of ASN. East Dunbartonshire, East Renfrewshire have low deprivation and low levels of ASN. Yet Orkney has high levels of ASN and low deprivation. So it's not a perfect correlation.
Just to add to that as well, where areas have done work promoting what a young carer is, for example, or identifying young carers, then they're going to be recorded more than areas that perhaps are not focusing on that as much just now. So one local authority I was speaking to last week was saying that they had done a big campaign about what a young carer is, so that people could recognise that in themselves, and that it's actually okay to talk to the school about that, that it's safe, that there's no risk to any involvement in their role. So where there is kind of that focus on a specific area or a specific issue, then you are going to get higher levels of recording there. Which is why some of this is important that local authorities work together and share what they're doing, so that they can learn from each other. And for example, in that young carer space.
Okay. I mean, is it a concern that we've got such a wide variation between councils? But the figures are quite stark. The proportion of pupils receiving ASL in 2023 ranged from 20% to 49% between councils. It's quite a big gap, isn't it? So, I mean, Stella, you mentioned earlier you're doing a project on data. Is that the kind of thing you're looking into? You know, the kind of we really need to know why, don't we, in order to target the resources.
Exactly. So we are planning to scope a project on data that will have both a national and a local level to it, and it's exactly to look further into those areas that you're discussing. What can we do? What more can we do with our data at national level as it is? At the same time, can we, with our colleagues in COSLA, consider some of these local issues around consistency, recording, consistency and identification of need?
And what's your timescale for that project?
So we will be scoping realistic timescales as part of that project. But I don't
wasn't
have a firm
answer.
No.
How long is it going to take? How long is it going to take to do it? It's not a trick question. I'm not trying to catch you out. Just 1 year, 2 years. What do you think?
It's likely to be iterative. So, for example, we're going. Or sorry, that's the wrong word. It's likely to be a staged process, because obviously it's a very complex issue. So, in the short term, what we've committed to is that we will publish the first iteration of the National Measurement Framework this year. In the PFG yesterday, it was announced that we would, during the year, hold a data summit with all local authorities to begin to explore these issues of consistency, etc., and data gaps that we've discussed. So those would be certainly the first steps.
One thing that I'm keen to do that not yet discussed with Scottish Government colleagues, so apologies, this will be a surprise to us all. The there's quite a lot of work on data, not just within additional support needs, not just within schools, but within wider children's services and indeed within health services and other areas as well. And what we don't want is a situation where we've got different definitions being used as they are just now in schools, that then a child is accessing another service and there's different definitions there. So really trying to join up that data, which will take a bit of time, but internally within COSLA we are connecting between the health and social care side of things, the digital side of things, the children and young people side of things, to try to make sure that we are approaching this from not just like the kind of siloed, this is what you are in education, this is what you are when you're accessing support elsewhere, because it's really important that for families, for children and young people, that they understand as well. I mean, it's complex for us to understand, it's complex for us when we're looking at it. So I can only imagine how complex it must be to navigate that as a parent. So really trying to connect the dots there. It will take a bit of time, but that work is underway on COSLA's side anyway, and keen to connect that with the work we're doing here.
So do you, Laura, think there needs to be greater consistency between councils on how they measure this?
I think that work is ongoing, yeah. Council. So Neil said earlier that a lot of it comes down to individual school staff recording, and what one teacher records as an additional support need may be something that a class teacher is confident in providing that they wouldn't see as an additional support need. So there's work going on between councils to try to understand how that's working. But at the end of the day, the way that we are doing it just now comes down to the individual teacher or school staff judgment, working with partners, working with the local authority. So there will always be a little bit of kind of professional judgment, and we have to trust those professionals that they know what's best for that child.
That actually takes us back to the point raised by Mr. Beattie and his very interesting table. He didn't say, but it's publicly available. It's from East Lothian. Actually, the interesting thing for me, that when it lists the reasons for pupils getting additional support for learning, there are 25 categories. 25. And you're expecting, individual teachers to be able to pick up on all these.
And individual young people may have relevant needs against a number of those categories, not just one. So
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, before you come in, there's a whole range of things, and I think, as you said right at the start, Mr. Rennick, sometimes a need is short term. That could be because of bereavement. That's one of the categories, or longer term. They may have autism or something like that. So there's a whole range of things. And when we look at high schools or even primary schools, youngsters may struggle in a particular subject but be brilliant at something else. So, it is very complex.
Yeah, I think both you and Mr. Beattie's questions have illustrated really well the complexity that we are trying to work through here, with the intention of trying to ensure that children and young people get the right support to be able to thrive in school.
And I come back to the point as well that meeting a need is more important than the identifying the reason for the need. Again, there's no need for diagnosis or whatever for that need to be met. The key priority within schools is overcoming the barrier to learning. So one thing that I'd be quite keen that we looked at through the data work is people quite often like to collect more data. I think I said that earlier, but no one likes to stop collecting data or take things away. But I think that there's something about how useful is some of this data compared to the data that we might need about what is the support that's being provided.
Yeah. And there's no point collecting data for data's sake. So,
100%.
Sorry, Stella. Your project needs to have an end result, however long it's going to take. It needs to lead to something.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about this subject, we're always assuming it's just youngsters who are struggling. Let's put it that way. But actually, one of the categories here was more able pupils, and we never talk about that. That they also need extra help, but for a different reason.
Yes. And it reflects very deliberately the aim around the original 2004 Act, and what since then has been about trying to support all pupils, and what that additional need might be reflects a whole range of different circumstances, and it is not purely a deficit model.
Okay. I've just got a couple of other things I would like to ask about. Exhibit 3 in the Auditor General's report, which shows this huge rise in the number of cases, nearly 800% in 20 years. And it's just going up. It just continues to go up. And we're now at over, 40% of pupils needing this extra help. In Glasgow, I was reading this morning, it's over 50%. These are astonishing figures, aren't they? At some point, you would hope it would slow down. Do you see any prospect of that?
I mean, what the Morgan Review concluded was that that this growth at that time reflected both a growth in recording of needs that were always there and of genuine growth in need. There have been changes. You'll see the big increase in 2010 when needs that were only temporary were included within the recording. There have been a number of different categories added in over time into this that weren't there before. You mentioned bereavement, but also family issues, risk of exclusion, etc., that are included within there. So that partly reflects the growth as well of new categories. But there has been, and again, speaking to teachers and to school leaders, they will say that there has been genuine increases in some areas, including autism spectrum, which you mentioned, or Mr Beattie mentioned earlier, but also around behaviour and neurodiversity issues, where they have seen a genuine increase. And it's not always clear what the drivers of that have been. COVID is part of it, but there was growth. There was growth prior to COVID as well. Again, Stella or Claire, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on that.
You don't have to. Just because Mr Rennick wants to bring you in, you don't have to come in.
I'm happy to come in, even though you didn't want me to come in. I think that some of this also reflects the more inclusive society that we have now, and the fact that we do recognise. So it's not just about recording; it's about recognition as well of need. I think maybe like 10, 20 years ago, we perhaps wouldn't have recognised some of these challenges, and instead would have perhaps not provided the support, not thought that children were not looked at how we overcome the barriers, but simply looked at other options for children. Whereas now we have a much more kind of inclusive society, as well as an inclusive support to school, inclusive approach to education. So there's an element of that in there, but I agree with what Mr Rennick said. What teachers, school staff, local authorities are saying, that they are seeing increasing challenges. There's a discomfort both through COSLA being raised at our board and personally with the use of words like behaviour, because actually there's lots of reasons that children might not be able to act in a way in school that is conducive to learning. So we're really keen that we consider the language of the promise and UNCRC in this space, and the negative connotations around words like behaviour and consequences and things like that are unhelpful when we're thinking about how we support children to learn.
One of the issues that schools raise with us is around the importance of the school environment and the school buildings as well. For example, having the space for nurture spaces or for alternative spaces for young people to go to, even just for a short period, to then come back into the mainstream class as well. So it's important to think of the school environment as well as the other types of support that young people receive.
Okay. Finally, I just want to ask about the ASL Project Board. So that's you, Laura. I think you're the co-chair of that. Now, the board is not due to report, I read, until 2028. Is that correct?
Partially. The board reports annually on progress against the the actions that emerge from the recommendations of the Morgan Review. the date of the most recent report escapes me. It was sometime towards November last year. And
what was that report?
The update on the action plan, so progress on the action plan, November last year. So there will be another update on that on an annual basis. And it sets out the progress that's made against actions since the last report. And it also highlights examples of where actions are, evidence of the actions being delivered, I suppose, which is really helpful for local authorities, for government, probably for yourselves. So happy to send you over some links to previous ones so you can see the examples of how these have been taken forward. That's not to say, and I recognise there are still many actions within that plan that we have not delivered on yet. One of the things that is a challenge in any big programme of change is the fact that you are running a system at the same time as you're trying to change a system, and therefore you almost have to have some double capacity there to be able to change the system as you're delivering it as well.
I mean, sorry, just to read from the Auditor General's report, in November 2024, the ASL Project Board considered a higher level approach to improving data recording and reporting by 2028. That's what it says here. So that, for me, that's quite slow progress. I mean, do you accept generally the board has been making slow progress?
I come back to the point that you're trying to, the system is, you've got the system as it is that you're trying, that is under pressure. You're trying to maintain that at the same time as you're trying to change it. There also, since the Morgan Review, obviously we had COVID and we had some disruption there. So there have been challenges there. In terms of the 2028 date, I would need to go back and check some of the wording around that in terms of what that's referring to. But I'm happy to follow up in writing unless Claire can come in on that.
Yeah, if I could. So just to reiterate that the action plan was responding to the Morgan Review, which I think you're well aware of. So it was much broader. It wasn't just specifically focused on data. It was about a whole host of different things around changing the culture and expectations and outcomes for children and young people. So we had 76 actions. In November last year, with our updated progress report, we completed 40 and we've since completed a further 13. So we have the remainder of actions are what we're focusing on for the rest of this parliamentary term. And then we need to take a bit of a stock check to figure out what's still required. Is it still relevant? Is it necessary? Do we need to adapt in terms of what's come out of Audit Scotland? I think, I'm not sure about the 2028 date, but I wonder if that's tied into the National Measurement Framework, which has 3 phases to it. The first phase, which will be completed this year, but we would need to double check that for you.
If I can just come back in, we will be obviously considering what's in the Audit Scotland report as a project board. We had an initial discussion on it. In fact, I think we've had 2 at project board meetings, but we're also considering wider reports, so the Education, Children and Young People Committee report and the recommendations from that. The Children's Commissioner published a report quite recently, so as well as we can't simply just look at the Morgan recommendations. At that point in time, we have to adapt with that, and as Claire said, see if they're still relevant, see if there is more that we need to do, see if there are actions that we need to prioritise and put more energy behind, which is why that we're focusing on the National Measurement Framework, communications and the Code of Practice as 3 key areas over the next year.
So you'll check the 2028 date for us and come back to us, but you've completed 53 out of 76 of the recommendations, so you've still got a way to go.
We do, and
I mean, are you going to manage to, complete the rest of them by next year?
I'm quite confident that we will. Yes, I have every confidence. I recognise that I'll be back here in a year, and and you'll tell me how confident I was. But no, I am. There's a great team behind that, and everyone on that project board is absolutely committed to that, and are there on top of their day job. And as I said, we've got parent representation. We also have a wider ASN network, which has an even kind of wider membership, and they advise the project board as well. So I'm very confident that there's a lot of enthusiasm behind this. So the report from Audit Scotland, the Education Children and Young People Committee report, all of the attention that is on this area is massively helpful just now, because it means that we are able as officials and as officers to prioritise it, because it's a political priority for us all across local government and Scottish Government. So as much as sessions like these can be a challenge, we really welcome the focus that's on this, and I know that parents, children and young people do as well.
And clearly the work is not going to stop next May. It's going to carry on from that. That this is 40% of the young people we've got in our system, potentially more than that if we have greater consistency. So this is the education system that we've got and that we're going to have to continue working to improve.
I'm delighted to hear it, Mr Rennick, and whoever's on this committee in the next session of Parliament will be able to see how you've done. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've got two members of this committee at this time who've still got to put some questions to you, so I'm going to move straight along and invite the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green, to put his questions to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I ask Director General, first of all, given the content of the Audit Scotland report, do you believe that the Scottish Government is currently getting it right for every child?
I think the evidence from, as I said earlier, I think the evidence from the Morgan review, from the committee review and from the Audit Scotland review says that there is more that we need to do to make sure that every child is getting, for us to have confidence that every child is getting the support that they need. But in saying that, I do not want to in any way belittle the fantastic work that individual teachers, schools, local authorities are doing to respond to those needs. But I think, as we've said in answer to all the questions, we know there is more to do, both in terms of recording what is happening and then looking at the nature of how you support young people, because there's lots of innovation happening and necessary innovation, but that also means that we need to look at what's working effectively and what's not. And that's why the work on the measurement framework is particularly important.
When you say there's more that we need to do, when you say we, who is the we? Because if we work on the assumption that teachers and pupil support assistants are working flat out and doing their very best, so they're at capacity essentially, there's nothing more they personally could do to help get it right for every child. So what is the gap? Where's the missing link? Yeah,
the we has to be everyone within the education system and clearly beyond the education system, because it also brings in health and social work and other services as well, that all of us have a responsibility around this. And that's part of the kind of our nervousness around timescales and talking about timescales, because it's not just about changing our practice within government or changing the approaches within COSLA. It's about how we inform and support individual schools and teachers in what they are doing. The Morgan Review concluded that school leaders are spending an increasing amount of time and rightly spending an increasing amount of time responding to this, and we need to make sure that we are supporting them that. We need to ensure that the teaching, the support and education that is available for teachers is preparing them for the kind of needs that Mr Beattie mentioned earlier on. So that's why there are so many strands of work linked to this, and it links in with all the other work that we're doing around the curriculum, around qualifications, around attendance, around attainment and around the school estate as well. So again, one of the things that's been really helpful in the discussions around this is making those connections between all the other parts of work that we in COSLA are doing. So that's a very long-winded answer to say it's everywhere.
It's very helpful, thank you. No, I think the point I will go on to make in my line of questioning, though, is that many of the issues which are categorised as being additional support need are actually non-educational. So they're health-related, they're social, they're wider societal, they're domestic issues, they're substance abuse, and family issues and bereavement. So many things that actually teachers can do nothing or very little about. What happens in the classroom will not affect what happens necessarily outside of the classroom. So in effect, you know, is this a scenario where you're never really going to be able to crack the nut on this, because so many other public agencies and bodies are involved in those wider societal issues which are resulting in poor outcomes for young people. Therefore, what happens in the classrooms we'll never be able to fix that.
It's a really good question. Something I've been thinking about as well. And Laura made a really important point earlier on that you don't necessarily need to have a diagnosis for schools and teachers to be able to respond to need and recognise a learning need that needs to be responded to and adjusted to. So even when that diagnosis isn't available, schools should be responding to those needs. But you're right, school is not a kind of sealed off thing that exists from the rest of society. And as well, all of those young people who are passing through the education system move on to other positive destinations, into colleges, into higher education, into work. So we need to ensure that society is responding to that as well. And again, that's partly why in answer to Mr Beattie's question about the impact on pupils that don't have additional support needs of having young people in their classes. Well, that's the world that we're all living in and all going to live in. So that's why it's beneficial for our schools to reflect that.
MSPs often do, I'll let you come in a second, yeah, MSPs often do school visits, or in fact sometimes we get asked to host a class for an hour or two, usually to give the teacher a break, I find. But it is interesting when you do observe classrooms across your various regions and constituencies that there is clearly a proportion of the classroom who is disruptive, and whilst the teachers are dealing with that, it's to the detriment of the learning of those pupils who want to get on and who are particularly gifted in certain classroom subject areas. And that's something you observe even on a short level, just in passing when visiting classroom. But I presume that's a mainstream issue. And I wonder how much work has actually been done by government to look at the negative effect that the presumption to mainstream is having on exceptional or pupils who have, what was it categorised as, more able pupils.
Just to reassure you, I've never been asked to look after a class. So
you should try it.
But absolutely, I mean, one of the things that I think is really helpful, and again, you will have seen this in visiting schools, that when we say mainstream education, maybe people have in their mind a traditional classroom, but within mainstream schools, there are specialist units. Within mainstream schools, there are spaces that young people can go to for a short period of time. There are individual interventions. There are pupil support assistants or learning assistants who are providing that support. So when we say mainstream, that can be a mix of different things that are responding to those needs that aren't just purely about being in a traditional classroom. Part of that is about trying to respond to those issues that you're saying is what helps young people learn best in terms of that. And it isn't always sitting in a traditional classroom for all of those classes, and it might be different for some classes rather than others. But I don't know if Laura and colleagues wanted to come in.
Not, but on the impact on the wider class, I suppose from what we know of the international evidence, that it's beneficial for everyone in the classroom if the presumption to mainstream and having a diverse mix of children and young people in a classroom in terms of learning about the ways that other people live and acceptance and all of that side of things. So there is evidence to show that it is beneficial in a citizenship side of things. But your earlier point about the fact that school teachers and class teachers and school staff are working flat out, what additional support can they provide? I mentioned earlier that we do need to think about the wider system and how we better use the professionals around schools, and for example speech and language therapy and other services which we know are under pressure as well. But at the same time, there's work that we can do probably to better work together around the needs of children and young people, so that they can be better supported in school. Children and young people are in school for a relatively small proportion of their lives, of their weeks, of their year. So there's a lot outside of the classroom that impacts on their learning, as you said, and that's a point that we consistently make when we're talking about, for example, teacher numbers and things like that. You know, the importance of youth work, the importance of family support workers, and therefore the importance of not having ring-fence funding. But that's probably a debate for another day. But yeah, the wider support that can be provided, youth work is very important for certain groups of children and young people, who perhaps school isn't working for them at that point in time.
Isn't that an interesting point? I mean, looking at the table that Mr Beattie provided, and just in one council area, and I appreciate every council will have different pressure points, but the largest statistic of people making up the ASL category is actually social, emotional and behavioural difficulty. And one can only assume that the rise in that, and there has been a steady rise in that percentage of the last 5-10 years, probably that's a long-term trend, is that pupils are, where there is a decline in discipline outside of the school environment, particularly in the home environment, that behaviour translates into the school environment. And that pupils who are experiencing wider societal emotional difficulties in the home environment or in social environments are bringing that into the classroom as well. But again, that's something that there's only so much a teacher can do in that respect. If other public agencies or other touch points of public services are letting those families down, then you're fighting a losing battle in the education environment. That's maybe the point I'm trying to make.
It's clearly important that we think about all the different interventions and support that's available for children and young people, and there are variations in terms of that support and what's available, and we're aware of that. But Stella,
yeah, maybe also just as an additional point, it's important to remember in all of this that the behaviour in Scottish schools research, I can't quite remember the date, but it was post-COVID, showed that most pupils are actually well behaved. So, just for a bit of, I suppose, balance.
They are, but then 27% of pupils in East Lothian are designated as having additional support need because of behavioural difficulties. And we know that violence in classrooms is on the increase and has been for a number of years. So I appreciate the majority of pupils go to school and act a bit behave well. And are brought up well. I do understand that. But here we're looking at ASL, so there's clearly a category of people who are struggling. That then leads to outcomes. I'm quite intrigued by the work that Audit Scotland's done on outcomes. Clearly we know that pupils with ASL have lower attendance rates, have higher exclusion rates, and there's also a 20% gap in CFE level outcomes and lower positive destination rates as well. So there are all a number of metrics which they're performing poorly. That can't be acceptable either, can it?
I mean, there are a range of factors behind that. There has been some positive progress in terms of reducing some of those gaps in terms of positive outcomes and improvement, for example, in the proportion of pupils with additional support needs achieving higher passes, etc. So there are positive signs in there as well. But yeah, it is an issue that we need to continue working on, and part of the aim is to try and deal with some of that inequality in terms of outcomes between pupils. But Stella?
And the national measurement framework work is also relevant in that context. So obviously the metrics that we have at the moment measure traditional academic attainment, and that may not be realistic for all pupils with additional support needs. So the national part of the purpose of the national measurement framework is to capture the achievements of children and young people with ASN who may not achieve in the sort of traditional academic sense, to capture wider achievements.
Yeah, and that's actually something that the Morgan Review picked up on, that other vocational destinations should be seen as positive outcomes as well when measuring like for like. So it's a very good point. Mr Rennie, obviously your department covers education, I believe, and justice. Yes. So has the Scottish Government done any analysis as to what percentage of young people exit the education system and enter the criminal justice system, and what percentage of those would have been identified as having additional support learning whilst in secondary education?
Yeah, thankfully, far fewer young people now enter the justice system than was the case 10-15 years ago, both in terms of being referred to the hearing system on offence grounds and going into the adult justice system. I don't have the data in front of me, but the last time I looked, it was something like a 70% drop. So we have made huge progress. Really, local authorities, the police, Crown Office, and others have made really good progress in terms of diverting young people away from the justice system. But we know that a higher proportion of people who end up in, for example, in prison have a care background, have learning disabilities, have other forms of need, and particularly ACEs is reflected in the population that end up. So we know that the more that we can do to support additional support for learning at an earlier stage, obviously starting in the very early years and then all through the system, then that hopefully helps to support people into positive destinations. And again, that's been one of the positive things over the last few years, has been the progress in terms of positive destinations that all young people, including young people with additional support needs, move to. But I'm keen that we continue working on continue working on the small proportion of pupils who leave school with no qualifications.
That's very helpful.
Yes,
yeah, of course.
I was just going to add that the Hayward review is really important in this, and the recommendations of the Hayward review. Really keen to link those as well, because that is about the less traditional, I suppose, qualification routes. And when we have the Scottish Youth Parliament, they came to our Children and Young People Board, and they do quite frequently, and they were really keen that the education system moved modernised, I suppose, to the kinds of things that they want and need to learn in terms of digital and in terms of the things that they will need for the future. So there's a link there between how we modernise that, qualifications, the approach to qualifications and the approach to measuring achievement, and children with additional support needs as well.
Thank you for raising the Hayward review. I think all three of those, the Morgan, Muir and Hayward reviews, are all helpful, but it's been some 5 years since the Morgan review published. It'll be 5 years next month. So there's a sense of frustration, I guess, that only 53 of the 76 recommendations have been reached, and it's taking a long time. We've known this problem's been on the increase for a long time as well. So I guess that's perhaps driving some of the lines of questioning this morning. So.
Yeah, it reflects it's a complex issue, but it's one that we're working on. But we're also responding to a moving picture, as the chart that was pointed out earlier, in terms of that growth. But there is work going on. A good example would be around the proportion of young people who are leaving school with technical and vocational qualifications, now around 35%. Leave with that. So widening those opportunities for young people is reflected in that wider work that we're taking forward. But again, I know there's more for us to do on that.
But also, just to be clear, that we're not saying in any sense that children with additional support needs cannot achieve these. I mean, the evidence shows that they are able to achieve the hires and all of that side of things as well. So it's about widening opportunities for all children and young people to have a diverse range of paths that they can follow.
The one area that we don't have time to really spend, I think what deserves more time, is how we support teachers and schools to deliver on this. But we are very short in time. I will, however, ask perhaps Mr Rennick, in 2021 the Scottish Government made an explicit and overt commitment to increase the number of teachers by 3,500 by the end of this parliamentary term, but particularly the number of pupil support assistants by 500. Could you give us a progress update on that?
Yeah, in terms of the number of pupil support assistants, I'm just looking for my statistics in here somewhere, if one of my colleagues can help me with that. There are, in the last year, there were 17,046 pupil support assistants, and that's an increase of almost 1,800 since 2020. So there has been a significant increase in the number of pupil support assistants, and we have more teachers now than we had in 2018. And COSLA and the Scottish Government have also made commitments around teacher numbers for the current year. But also important issues that have certainly been raised with me have been about non-class contact time, which can allow teachers to prepare for the needs of young people with additional support needs as well. And again, an issue that we're working with local government on.
Well,
okay.
One of the, I suppose, challenges around the teacher number side of things is the fact that we have the highest pupil-teacher ratio across the UK, or the lowest. I mix the two up. More teachers per pupil than rest of the UK, and we have fallen school rules in many areas, and therefore it would, if we're especially when we're thinking about additional support needs, we need a wider range of professionals around children than simply teachers. That's not to say that teachers aren't important, and that's not to say that we don't need more teachers in certain areas. We know that there are recruitment and retention issues in particular areas, particularly north of the Central Belt, but we need to think about the wider workforce and not simply teachers who need the support of the wider system to support the children and young people and their families.
Does every secondary school in Scotland have someone that supports children with mental health? Is there a qualified, dedicated mental health support contact, not a teacher, in every single secondary school in Scotland?
I believe that there is a commitment to access to counselling through schools, and so that the counselling may not be 100% based in a school that's only got a few pupils, but there is access to that support.
Okay, that's different. Okay, thank you. We are very short on time, so I guess my last question is one of the pages of the Audit Scotland report talked about the bigger statistic about dedicated ASL provision, and it's quite a low statistic, which is why I'm asking about it. It says it's 20% of all schools, about 480 something schools. 20% seems a very low number of schools to have dedicated ASL provision, using the terminology of the Audit Scotland report. Yet ASL presumably is prevalent in all schools. So just talk me through that.
Yeah, it's really important. I'll bring Stella in, but you're absolutely, every school has support available for additional support for learning, but there are specialist provision in a number of schools.
Okay.
But Stella?
I suppose it's worth bearing in mind in that context that 93% of children with ASL are spending all of their time in mainstream classes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So it's a small proportion of schools that will have a separate dedicated provision rather than the mainstreaming of the ASN assistance, if you like.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I think it's in the Audit Scotland report. Not every local authority has has special needs schools or schools with special needs facilities in them. So there can be support within local authorities or out of local authority support as well.
The model of delivery is very much dependent on what's available within the learning estate. So, as said, there is some special schools, 107 is quoted in the report, but out with that there may be enhanced provisions as well within the learning estate. But depending on what's available, there may be other staffing models, so there may be outreach workers or other types of workers that are centrally based that then visit schools. So it really does depend on the type of buildings and capacity within that, but everyone has access to the type of requirements that is needed.
Okay. I'm sure a good follow-up to this, Convener, would be hearing from some of the teaching unions about what they say in response to some of the evidence we've heard, so maybe that's something we'll think about.
And the teaching unions are represented on the project board.
Yes. They're on the project board, and they're also on the Cyberbus, the relationships and behaviour group as well.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks. And just for completeness, Laura Caven, you're a co-chair of the project board. Who is the other co-chair?
Alison Taylor, who is on holiday and therefore not here.
But from the Scottish Government?
From the Scottish Government, yes.
She's the Deputy Director responsible for this area.
Okay, right, thank you. Right, I'm now going to invite Stuart McMillan to put some final questions to you. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Just on the point of the project board, and certainly from what we've heard today, haven't really heard much said about the voice of the young people and also the voice of parents with regards to any of the issues. So can you provide me with a bit of reassurance that actually those voices are actually being heard and listened to?
Yes, I can. Parent groups are represented on the Additional Support for Learning Project Board. Government colleagues will have to help me out with the new name, with the name of the new representative group for parents who are there. In terms of children and young people's voices, there is the inclusion ambassadors. They are not part of the project board, largely because we want to make sure that we're working with them in the way that works for children and young people. I mean, they aren't going to want to come and sit at a meeting, and therefore we engage with them in other ways. We engage with them as COSLA through the Children and Young People Board as well, through SYP and through other organisations. So there is engagement with children and young people, and that is really important to us, really important to me as well.
Yeah, just to confirm, it's Connect Scotland that are the new parental representation on the board, and also just to add to what Laura has said, that all of the organisations and partner bodies that are part of the project board, so Children in Scotland, our unions, our Education Scotland colleagues, etc., we all have a commitment to engage directly with children and young people in any of the work that we do, so that anything that is fed into the development and progress towards the actions is brought back to the project board and discussed, and that goes for the same for parents and carers as well.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. I think earlier on in the evidence session, Laura, I think you spoke about and highlighted a bit about you don't need to get diagnosis to then also get assistance. Now, I know I've had a lot of engagement with parents over the last year in my constituency, and that point about the diagnosis has come up, where sometimes it actually has been some challenges in terms of actually getting the assistance to help, because there hasn't been a diagnosis, or the information just hasn't been passed on. So just to kind of highlight that point, that sometimes the processes with that information sharing might not, they might fail. Also, it's not a universal thing, I hasten to add. But it's just, I'm seeking a bit of reassurance on this element, that that's something that's also being looked at, because that's quite a small, a very small aspect of what really is a hugely complex area, and I understand that and I appreciate that. But if that small bit can be guaranteed, then it can actually have a very much a positive impact in terms of young people.
Yeah, I was speaking to our ADES member on the ESL project board about this a couple of days ago, and the importance of that featuring quite strongly in the communications work that we do over the next little while. As well as that, I think that there's public-facing work to be done around parental and children and young people's awareness of the fact that they don't, I mean, in other areas of life they may require that diagnosis to access support, but certainly in the education system they should not. So we'll be working hard to make sure that the education system is fully aware of that, and to make sure that families are aware of that as well.
It's perhaps also worth picking up that that will be an issue that will be front and centre of the Code of Practice refresh, which will be taking place over the next few months. Yeah.
Okay. And certainly kind of doing this, going through this piece of work, but also I was on the Education Committee and was involved in the previous report. And also the engagement I've had with parents, not just over the last 12 months in particular, but also I'm the Deputy Chair of Cross-Party Group in Dyslexia and the Chair of the Cross-Party Group in Visual Impairment. I've kind of reflected a great deal about young people that I went to school with, but also older people who I've met in my community, where the so-called world-class education system that Scotland had in the past failed many people. And particularly, some of the strongest testimonies I've heard are from people who have got dyslexia. And I know there has been a great deal of improvement in particular helping young people with dyslexia. But I also know that there are still challenges there with regards to certain maybe some people still not wanting to recognise that dyslexia is a thing that it exists. So I would encourage both the Scottish Government and COSLA, when undertaking your work that you're doing, and also the engagement you're having certainly with unions and also elsewhere. But that aspect about dyslexia is hugely important. I've got an example in my mind that, from the last couple of years, and this is the last couple of years, where somebody had to remove their child from one primary school to go to a different one because of the lack of acceptance about dyslexia.
I'm really sorry to hear that, and I'm really happy to engage with the cross-party group if that would be helpful, so that we can have a further conversation about the issues that are raised there, and we can connect those in with the work that the project board is doing.
And dyslexia is one of those issues where, again, visiting schools, that schools will talk about the benefits of that technology can sometimes provide in terms of adjusting how classroom teachers teach, using the systems that help pupils with dyslexia to be able to overcome the challenges that they face. So it's a good example where there are known interventions and methods that can help the young people. So it would be be really disappointed if there were examples where those opportunities weren't being taken.
Okay. Well, certainly I will be in touch with you, and I'll speak to the convener of that cross-party group. So the Deputy Convener spoke about touched upon the presumption of mainstream, and with some of the work I've undertaken with parents, this is an issue that has come up regularly. So I undertook a survey. We just finished at the end of April, and this is the first bit of information I'm going to put into the public domain, but we're going back to everyone who responded to it. We asked a question about the presumption of mainstream, and those who supported it was 29.49%, and those who think it's now past its sell-by date and want to do something different, 70.51%. Now, I've heard in various fora that potentially, also with the 2004 Act, and as the report indicates, with that 800% increase, potentially that presumption of mainstream should now be looked at again. And I don't know if there is any undertaking or any work being looked upon in that regard.
Again, I'll bring others in. As I say, the international evidence would still suggest that the presumption of mainstreaming and that inclusive education is still the right approach to take for education systems as a whole. Although the legislation was 2004, there was guidance on the presumption of mainstreaming published in I think 2019, so relatively recently, to try and help with reflecting that and applying that. I think one of the things that the Morgan Review emphasised was the importance of communication with parents and carers and children and young people, and part of that has to be explaining what that presumption of mainstreaming looks like in reality, because it is, as I say, it is not that traditional method of education that you talked about. There are a whole range of different options within mainstream schools and interventions that school apply to try and make sure that that mainstreaming approach works for young people. And clearly a lot of that is by the actions of individual classroom teachers, but it can also be with the physical environment within the school as well. And certainly last week I met with a number of young people with fairly significant additional support needs who were in a mainstream school but received additional support within that. And they were emphasising the benefits that being part of the wider school environment gave in terms of being part of clubs and being part of visits and so on. So it's recognising those wider benefits that aren't just purely about academic or education outcomes. But Stella?
Yeah, and probably, again, just to emphasise that it is just a presumption, and I think we all acknowledge that there will always need to be a range of provision in Scotland to meet all children's needs.
Actually, there are still around 8,000 young people in special needs schools and other young people who are accommodated in specific provision within other schools or within mainstream schools as well.
And just to add that local government remains committed to presumption to mainstream. That is the principle is absolutely right from our perspective at this point in time.
Okay. Paragraphs 46 to 55 and also 59 and 60 of the report were certainly really kind of interesting in terms of looking ahead and trying to deal certainly with some of the challenges. And as I said at the outset, I mean, I acknowledge that this is a hugely complex area, and every child is different, so trying to do something that's actually going to be that broad is very much a challenge. But certainly one of the aspects was the situation regarding the teacher training on ASL. And the Scottish Government's commitment to considering options about this. So I'm keen to try and understand also kind of where the Scottish Government are with regards to additional training. I know we've obviously heard in terms of the increase, also the pupil support assistance, the 17,046, but certainly additional training is very much required as well.
Yeah, again, I'll bring colleagues in, but Stella mentioned earlier the £29 million that was included within the budget, and a key focus of that funding shared with local government is around supporting the SN workforce in terms of retaining and recruiting and training the SN workforce. The National Framework for Inclusion that was prepared by the Scottish Universities Inclusion Groups, that's all the universities that provide teacher training, specifically provides guidance on what the expectations are of not just new teachers but existing teachers as well in terms of inclusive education. It provides kind of reflective questions that teachers can ask themselves around how they ensure that they're providing that inclusive practice. So there has been work over recent years to try and make sure that we're supporting the teaching and the wider workforce in terms of being able to respond to the challenges that we've been talking about. But I don't know if Claire and Stella want to say any more about that aspect.
I can come in quickly here. So there's obviously a broad spectrum. I think I mentioned this earlier on around the different time of a person's career in terms of what they might be looking at in terms of development and learning. So there are some considerations happening around the initial teacher education where Ministers made a commitment to look at the ASN content of that, so that work is ongoing, and our colleagues in the Scottish Council of Deans are considering that, so we can provide an update once we have more content and understanding. But I think recognition of different points in a person's career is critical, and in our additional support for learning action plan we have specific work that is looking at that and what's already available and what gaps there are in terms of that teacher training that we're starting to see now in response to changing complexities or the changing context. And our colleagues Education Scotland are very much driving forward that work. So at the moment they have a framework, I think it's called Inclusion, Equalities and Wellbeing, but I think I might have got that wrong. But it's got different levels of training for different depths of training that you might require on specific aspects. So there's a whole spectrum of work underway at the moment. And as Stella mentioned earlier, the investment, the additional 28 million will support some of that as well.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on the points about pupil support assistance. And there's a variety of different roles across the country in terms of the grades, the titles, the jobs that they do. And that makes it very difficult to identify one solution that, in terms of training and taking forward their support in terms of their role. There has been quite a lot of work being done jointly between the Scottish Government and COSLA, and there is a group specifically looking at training for this group of staff, but also is there induction specifically that could be looked at collectively, and also the accreditation and registration of these staff as well. And there is a report to be coming out due in the next couple of weeks around those potential options.
Okay, no, that's helpful. So certainly when that report is published, I think it would be useful to certainly send that directly to the committee as well. So, because I was actually just about to ask a question about the accreditation and registration, so that's actually very helpful, so thank you. So just, I'm conscious of time, but in terms of the improving of the outcomes for young people, so what else is the Scottish Government looking at and planning to do to improve the outcomes for pupils with additional support needs, and also to target the available resources in a better function. Now, I know we did touch upon the deprivation point earlier, and also there's a wide variety of other aspects. And some of that, and I know certainly has been covered earlier, but if there is anything else that you would want to actually kind of put on the record today in that regard, that would be very helpful.
Again, I'll allow others to come in. From my point of view, the thing that I'm really keen that we make sure that we do is make sure that the needs of young people with additional support needs are reflected across the full range of work that we're doing on the curriculum reform, on qualifications, on the school estate, and it's just making sure that that's embedded across all the work that we are doing as part of that, alongside the specific work that we're taking forward under the action plan, is the thing that I think has been really helpful in terms of highlighting from this and the previous reports. But I don't know if others.
Yeah, certainly. I think that is a very good point in terms of, to use the word mainstreaming in a different sense, when we're thinking about policy development in other areas of education, like curriculum, like learning estate. We need to be thinking about ASL within that. So so thinking about the needs of all children, and in particular children with additional support needs in other areas of education policy.
I think certainly that is very helpful, but I think one of the points that certainly that Colin Beattie touched upon, also with the example from the local authority, was it East Lothian? I'm sure it was. East Lothian, yeah. This is East Lothian local authority with the different range of reasons that they have. I think, using this as an example, I think it would be really helpful to have a consistent approach across the country. Now, I'm not saying there isn't, because I don't know. But if there is a consistent approach in terms of the categorisation, that might actually assist going forward in terms of planning and looking at different policies. I think Mr. Rent, you touched upon earlier regarding Glasgow with English as an additional language, a second language. That clearly is not going to be an issue in other parts of the country. So I think clearly you will have particular spikes depending on what the situation is. But I think if there is that consistent approach in terms of the categorisation, that certainly, in my opinion, that would certainly help in terms of any future activity and planning.
I'll come back to the point that's important, that's helpful, but we also need to look at the need rather than just the categories, because you can have children that are in one category that all have different needs, and you can have children in different categories that have the same needs. So we, in terms of resource and in terms of training and things like that, we need to look at the need as much as we look at the reason for the need.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to bookend this session by returning to the recommendations. And actually, Laura Caven, you seem to be hesitating a bit about whether you accept the recommendation, which is about more consistent data nationally, which I think has been a theme of this morning and a theme of the Audit Scotland and Accounts Commission report and recommendations. One of the aspects, and again I reflect on this when Stella Smith was answering one of the questions which I think Graham Simpson was putting to you, is not only are the recommendations in this report, there are also suggested timescales for meeting those recommendations. So if I can end by asking, do you accept the timescales that the Auditor General and, as I say, the Accounts Commission are recommending here?
Yeah, this is something that we were talking about ourselves earlier on, just in terms of that. I think that's the one part where we were kind of slightly hesitant, not because there isn't an urgency around this, there clearly is, but again, as we've talked about, there is complexity. I would certainly be really keen, as part of the work on the summit that Ministers announced yesterday and the programme for government, again subject to cause the colleagues' views, that timescales is one of the issues that we talk around that, and that's important not just in terms of our own systems, but as well then, because this is made up of hundreds, the information we've got, the data we've got is made up of thousands and thousands of individual subjective decisions by teachers and schools. So we need to make sure that not just having the data, but then how do we share that? How do we share that consistently across the systems that we've got as well has to be part of that. So I would certainly be keen that part of the work on the summit is looking at what realistic timescales are for our work on this.
So would I be right to infer from that you think some of the Accounts Commission Auditor General timescales might not be realistic?
I think it's good to have that challenge, but I don't want to...
So I'll take that as a yes.
I don't want to presume that all of these complexities can be dealt with within 6 months, 12 months, or whatever. I want to make sure that we're properly considering that, but giving it due urgency.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said yourself earlier on, Director General, this is not just about data. Yeah. It's about the operation of the system. Exactly. And whether... I mean, I'll finish on this point, which I often is one of my refrains, which is that children are only 5 once, 8 once, 11 once, 15 once. There's no point coming back in 4 years' time saying we've solved it, because for that cohort of young people it may be too late. So there needs to be, I think, a sense of urgency about addressing some of the challenges that are set out in this report that we're considering this morning.
But again, Convener, I'm really glad that you raised that. I hope that between us we have been clear that there is not an air of complacency around this. This is a hugely significant issue for our education system, for our young people. It's a key part of the work that we are taking forward and going to have to take forward. And we will continue to prioritise the work on that, because exactly as you say, this is a reflection of the needs of thousands and thousands of individual pupils, and not just those that have additional support needs, but also their peers as well.
OK, well, look, thank you very much indeed. That almost takes us to a full 2 hours. So I'd like to place on record the thanks of the committee for both your time and your input this morning. So can I thank Joanna Anderson? I apologise, your name was misspelt, Joanna. Joanna Anderson, Suzanne MacLeod and Laura Caven from COSLA, thank you very much for your input this morning. And can I also, on behalf of the committee, thank Claire Henderson, Stella Smith and you, Director General, for your input this morning too. So with that, I'm going to move the committee into private session.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay.